Hello and welcome to the next part of the painting exercises that we were doing last term. Uh, this time I'm going to be painting the single apple, but this time in colour. So a little bit of a different approach to what we were doing when we were doing it just in black and white. For those of you that do all day on a Wednesday, this is of course our exercise that we would have done in the afternoon. But of course, as I said previously, any of you are more than welcome to give this a go. Either working in acrylic, gouache is another good option, particularly if you've just got watercolours. Use white gouache as your white, and that will give body to your colour, and so that you're able to paint light over dark, which is probably the most key thing about this exercise. You've got to have that ability because you're only working within that 30-minute time frame. So just in terms of reminding you all again, work within a 6 by 8 inch rectangle. You're giving yourself half an hour to complete the painting. So whatever you do in that half an hour, you stop. These are exercises that you can do again and again and again. They fine tune you, they keep your eye locked in, and they teach you to make decisions quickly and to trust your gut that when you put something down, you leave it. So a 6 by 8 each rectangle starting with a single object and painting that in half an hour. You'll then go on and do a second object, or introduce a second object I should say, and then paint the two objects in half an hour, and then the third part, same exercise but painting 3 objects in the half hour. Again, like last time, start with your biggest brushes and work down towards your smaller brushes. Work with these big brushes for as long as you can. The longer you work with those, the more painterly, the bigger the marks that you're making. You're not getting down into those nitty-gritty, fine things that we don't need to worry about. We need to be dealing with the big main statements, the big light darks, and working our way down to those smaller statements. In terms of how you're approaching the colour, you'll notice this time I don't have the grey, that I have actually placed a green cloth behind the apple in this case, and that's because my subject matter is red. So when your subject matter for this exercise is red, what I'm wanting to do is place the complementary colour as the background. So in this case, the opposite on the colour wheel is red. So if you're dealing with something that is a yellow object, for instance, your background would be violet. If you're dealing with something that's orange, your background would be blue, and vice versa. So, and of course, taking into consideration any of those other complementary pairs on the color wheel. So a red violet is opposite to a yellow orange, etc., etc. The other thing when you're painting this is not to, and particularly for those of you that have done some painting with me before, or again that have done colour classes, is that when we talk about complementary, we're not just talking about complementary in terms of hue or the colour name, so green, red. We also need to start thinking about complementary in terms of tone, saturation, and temperature. So I'm going to run through in a moment some of the colours that I'm using on my palette that take into consideration and enable me to deal with those 4 elements of colour, not just that single element. The other thing that we have used in painting before, and you might find it now useful to get this out and use it, is something like one of those, which is a piece of card with a little 1/4 inch hole in the centre of it. Try and have a piece of card that's fairly neutral in colour, and so that you can place this with your hand outstretched like that and look through it to identify and look for and isolate the colour on the object that you're looking for. And be asking yourself when you're looking through that, what colour am I looking at in terms of the name of the hue? Is it a light or a dark colour? So there you're dealing with tone. Is it dull or bright? Think about, is it that's the saturation, so is it, if it's a bright colour, it's saturated. If it's dull, it's desaturated. And of course, you can, to a degree, start to think about the temperature of the colour, but the temperature is something that you can play with to help emphasise form and emphasise things going forward and going backwards. So let's look at the palette of colours that I'm going to use. So this is my palette and my layout of colours. It's a fairly simple range of colours that I'm going to be using for painting the apple today. 2 yellows, 2 reds and 2 blues plus white. So this is my normal layout of my palette. I always have white there in the centre, and then working through to reds and yellows out this way, and then blues, greens, and there's some of the earth brown, earth reds and things here as well. So if I have more colours out, and as you know, whenever I lay out my colours, even if I'm just using a limited palette like I'm using here, is that I always lay the colours where they would normally be, no matter what. So that particular blue is always in that spot there, that particular yellow is always in that spot there, white always remains there. So as always, come up with a system and stick to it. In terms of the actual colours that I've got out here today, so as I said, I've got titanium white just here, and we'll start over this end. So I've got cadmium yellow lemon, cadmium yellow medium, cad red medium. This is permanent madder lake deep, which is a Rembrandt oil colour, but more commonly known as alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and Prussian blue. So for those of you that know and have done a bit of colour theory with me, you'll know that then within each of those 3 sets of primaries is that I've got a warmer and a cooler version of each. Some of them are cooler or cold, some of them are hot or warm, but broadly speaking, there's a cool and a warm and a cool, and a warm and a cool. So it means that I've got a little bit of control over in the temperature that I'm making and using to do certain parts. So I'll be mixing then, of course, using something like the Prussian blue and the cadmium lemon yellow to be making the green for the background. If I'm wanting then to grey that out a little, is that then I will use its complementary. So I'll have mixed a green, and the nice complementary to that in terms of this palette is actually to go to here, the cad red medium, because it's warmer. I've mixed a cool green. When we want to cool something, or when we want to neutralize something more successfully, is if we add a warmer red to that, we will get a truer middle, or a truer neutralized color than if we were to use this red. This red would still neutralize it, and it neutralizes it in a different way. This is a little bit more subtle than what this would be, and I think more successful to use this one. At the other end of the scale is that I'm using then predominantly this, and this, so the cad yellow medium, the cad yellow red medium, and the ultramarine blue to do a lot of the work within the pear, or the apple itself, as well as I'll sneak in a little bit of this red to help darken this red too. The one thing I would say to you is when you're approaching and you painting the whatever you're choosing as your single object, is that try when you're mixing the colours, particularly if you're wanting to chase very naturalistic colours, is be mixing using 1, 2 and 3 in your mixes, would be one point that I would say. So for instance, with the reds of the apple, is that its main body would be there in with that, and maybe in some areas it will need a little bit of cad yellow medium to get it maybe a little bit more. But as soon as you sneak in a tiny bit of that blue, and that it neutralizes it just ever so slightly, and will make it a little bit more natural in terms of the color that you're seeing. It also, when it comes to areas like the halftone, where you want to make that have a little bit more oomph, a little bit more saturated colour. And if I'll put then just a little bit of Cad Red light in amongst that. It really makes that, because you're getting a nicer contrast, so it really makes that colour glow when you introduce something that then is more saturated into it like that. Too, when we're going then into, as I said, darkening, so I'm just going to add, you can see here I'm using the alizarin crimson. Even though it's cooler, it starts to darken very nicely as well, these reds, and we're getting that nice subtle, and you can start to see even just what I'm doing here on the palette here, we're getting some nice transitions going on. For that final transition to a dark, and that's where when you start to analyze your colors and be really looking, is that you'll notice that maybe that's where I'll just sneak in, and I'm actually mixing more of a violet in that case by adding in that little bit of ultramarine. So we're getting a nice graduation of tone here, not just of color. Don't be afraid when it comes to the lighter tones in something like the apple that I'm doing, is also don't just try and maybe add lots and lots of the yellow to get that color lighter. So there you can start to see it lighten up. Get it back a bit red, but it still has a fair bit of intensity to it. And when I'm looking at the apple today, I actually need to be lightening it with a fair bit of white, and that's where we're actually getting into some of those really light colors that we're seeing on the apple today. So don't be afraid to add plenty of white in your lights. When you're doing that, is to take your white and add the color to it like that, and that means that it'll go quite light very, very quickly. Rather than taking a lot of this and trying to add white to it, you're going to end up with a great big pile of color that you don't use. Whereas if you take from in, add in, you're going to have a lot more control. And you can see there I'm getting really quite light and tinted when I work like that. One last thing I think I'll show you before I go on is the background colour, and in this case, as I said, it was a mix of the Prussian and the Cad Yellow Lemon. You can see there it makes the colour quite fluoro, but we don't necessarily want it quite so fluoro. It's quite jarring against these reds. It's when we start to then neutralise it. So I'm just going to take a little bit of white like that and take a little bit of this green. So that's now starting to lighten it. And into that, we're going to add just a little bit of red, and that was way too much. No, actually, no, it's not too bad. And I think you can see that in terms of being complementary, sits far nicer and is not quite so, well, yes, jarring. Well, it depends on what you want to do. If you want it to be jarring, that's the way you want to go. But if you don't want so jarring, this slightly more neutralised green here is the way to go. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might be using and mixing or choosing colours for your subject matter. Don't necessarily go with this range of colours because your single object might be a different object to mine. This is what suits my apple that I'm working with. But be trying to think and choosing and keeping to a limited palette like this. Don't just put out every single colour that you've got. Be thinking about a couple of yellows, a couple of reds and a couple of blues, and that they also then have a temperature difference to them as well.